Therefore, after all of this introduction and silly things, is what Ray mentioned, how the project that began our practice. It was an international design competition in 1989 that we entered. It was registered were, I believe, 1,400 various architects from around the world. 700 were taken in and 500 were judged, of which we were one of the groups. None of us in the group was over the age of 30. We were all more or less fresh out of school, and we attempted to do this competition as a group together. And it was an astonishing experience when we got the call that we won. I was in California at the time. I remember the experience well. I was in the shower when the phone rang and they said you won it. I went outside and started screaming and realized that I was still naked and dripping wet from the shower. I was so overwhelmed. But we flew out to Egypt, and very quickly. I used all my prize money to pay for the airplane ticket to get to Egypt, so that was that in one ticket. We arrived, all of us as young adults, really fresh punks almost out of school. And because the competition was anonymous, nobody knew who Snohetta was. So we showed up, and they looked at us and said, "Who are you?" And I had actually very long hair at that time, even longer than Alexander the Great's hair. And they said, "Well, you must be, one of the visitors." And we said, "No, we're Snohetta." And their faces went white. Who are these crazy young people? Well, that's nice to meet you. When does Mr. or Mrs. Snohetta arrive? And we said, "Well, we are it." And they said, "But you're so young." It was a $350 million job. And I think I just sort of blurted out of my mouth, though, "It's a good thing you chose a young architect because anyone else will be dead by the time this thing is finished." And it took 13 years to complete, so I think I was somewhat correct. The other thing that is true about this, and this is very interesting, I believe, for students and you young people, and that is that there is a great deal of power in being naive. And we are all naive as we're in school and just out of school. We really don't recognize the pitfalls that our profession has before us. So in a sense, a more intelligent, a more mature architect would have just walked away and said goodbye, and I'm glad I won, and I'm not going to build it. But we used this sort of power of youth to push the project through. It had an enormous history already related to it. This is the ancient harbor of Alexandria in Egypt. This harbor has been in continuous use in much the same manner that it is today for the past 17,000 years. So this city predates Homer and the Iliad, writing of the Iliad. It predates Alexander the Great by thousands of years, predates the Pharaonic period. So it's an enormously important city in the Mediterranean and in the world. The red circle that you see on the right is the site of the Alexandria Library, and this is where Cleopatra once had her museum, which was very similar to the place that we're in here today at Carnegie Mellon, a place where the arts freely intermingled. There wasn't a sort of separate museum and a separate school. Everything was all merged into one. And the site on the left, in the little blue circle there, that's the site of the ancient wonder of the world, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, which many of you maybe know from school tales when you were younger. This beautiful circular form was an important part of how we saw the project, but the power of history was very enormous here. This is a picture that I took facing straight down onto the ground after they had pulled about 1 meter of topsoil off the site. And you were already in all directions, about 150 meters in any way that you looked, treading on human remains that were 1,000 years old or more, pottery fragments from different stages of history throughout Egypt and Alexandria's lifespan. And so you just could not escape this. The power of history was so enormous that we very quickly realized you can easily become a prisoner of history. The influence of this world is so vast. So we knew that we had to escape this kind of feeling, and we began to create a building which tied together history and the future, which of course are artificial things. The history and the idea of the future are about as useful as one another because they don't actually exist. The only thing that truly exists is our present time. And so in a sense we made a building that somehow recognized a moment in time. So it's this tilting disc which rotates around a point on the ground and descends into the earth where much of us think the past resides metaphorically, and ascends in toward the sky where we see heaven and the future, alongside the Mediterranean. And the roof itself leads one's eye toward the heavens or to the sky. We like to say that the sky is a form of landscape just as much as the earth that you walk upon, all of these things are linked, and the building is attempting to bring these worlds together. These different modules are controlling daylight into the building and also giving you a map of the building's internal arrangement before you enter. And it slices in this diagonal manner across the very perpendicular quality of the historical structures along the waterfront, allowing you to experience the urban condition in a unique way. This is a very wonderful picture of the building just after it was completed, with fishermen still, as I say, rowing without motors to catch their fish for the day, of which they bring home some for their family and some to sell at the market. And amazingly, and as I say, in the same manner for eons. And the building, despite its enormous size, it's 800,000 square feet, about 80,000 square meters, it feels very low in the horizon, and it's actually very humble, I think, in the way it steps down towards the water rather than occupying or owning the space. The buildings adjacent to it, for example, are only about 100,000 square feet, and they seem much bigger because of their silhouette. The stone wall which surrounds the building is about 23,000 square meters of hand-carved granite. To give you an idea of scale, this is about 6.5 feet high, each of these stones. And they're carved with inscriptions from around the world, alphabets from about 10,000 years of various kinds of languages. It took us 6 years simply to research the characters that are appearing on the facade. They represent a kind of an aesthetic of language. They don't say anything in particular. To get that stone, we wanted to bring it from somewhere nearby in Egypt. This is years and years ago, before the word sustainability even existed, but we recognized the need, especially in Egypt, to be sustainable, otherwise the building couldn't be built. So we found finally a quarry in the southern part of Egypt that was big enough to bring the stones, that many stones, to Alexandria. It was on the border of the Sudan, which some of you may know, Egypt and Sudan have been at war for about 20 years over the border line. They don't shoot at each other, but they just disagree on where the border is. So this was actually a demilitarized zone occupied by the Sudanese and Egyptian military, where this quarry was. We actually had to negotiate a peace treaty between the two countries to get the stone out. After we got through to the quarry site, which had been dead for about 600 years, we found out this was the same quarry that about 70% of the stones at the temples at Karnak had been quarried from. It was a rather astonishing find. We actually discovered several obelisks that were nearly finished, that were unfinished obelisks that had resided in that quarry and never taken to Karnak. But there's a wonderful image here, which is the juxtaposition of these two edifices. There are probably 2,000 years between them, but the stones came within 300 or 400 meters of one another, the library on the right and temple in Karnak on the left. The space itself is rather expressive, but very intimate at the same time. It seats about 3,000 people. The main reading room is about 3 times the volume of the central hall at Grand Central Station, which some of you may have been in, to give you an idea of the volume. But despite this enormous size, it feels very intimate, very calm, and you always feel that you're collected within these modular columns that allow you to define your space. To give you, again, an idea of height, this is about 60 feet high. Laying out furniture in a space that's this big is more like doing an urban plan than a furniture layout. So everything has to be understood in terms of transportation avenues and infrastructure and so on. The library was open to equal access for men and women. It was a first building in the region to be fully designed as a handicapped accessible building. It set the stage for building codes in the Middle East, which didn't exist. We actually had to write the building codes in Egypt to make this building happen. It's been very well loved and very well received. And one of the things I wanted to mention just to close down on this project, as you are aware, there were tremendous uprisings in Egypt in the last few months. One of the parts of the project that we fought very hard for was this plaza, which exists towards the city center and towards the Mediterranean. And the original building authorities wanted us to build a wall around that plaza because it's traditional in Egypt that any open square should be enclosed with a wall so that the police can contain people in the event of some kind of political turmoil. We fought for 4 years to not put up the wall. We won the fight. And we thought that would be the end of it, and of course during the uprisings we wondered what was happening. We sent emails to our friends in Alexandria for fear that the library was either being burned down again or somehow it was being rifled through and books stolen and so on. Well, we had good news. In fact, the people of Alexandria formed a human circle around the building during the entire period of uprisings. The amazing thing was that it was both anti-government and pro-government citizens that were joining in this circle, so there were no politics involved. The infrastructure inside the building housed peaceful debate amongst the different groups of people, and also they allowed for young people and old people, students and citizens to come together in one location, not only for debate but also for prayer. They closed off the street in front of the library, which was the central prayer area to the side of the uprisings, just about a block away. And so I thought it was a really wonderful sort of, not conclusion, but chapter in that building's history that was originally, of course, having a story of tragedy, of its falling down and burning down and all these other things, and being a kind of political wedge between people, and then opening that wedge and allowing people to connect despite their differences, and that's where we'll leave it. I'm going to I know we're in a hurry.